G'day, welcome to the program. I'm David Lipson. On the show today, a new shot in Labor's history wars. Julia Gillard claims Kevin Rudd was depressed early in 2010 and in no state to fight the election. But first, Parliament returns next week after the winter break, and there's still no sign the Senate crossbench are finding the government's controversial budget measures any more palatable. So what is the government's next move? Finance Minister, Senator Mathias Cormann, joins me now, as he does at this time every fortnight. Thank you very much for being with us.
Good to be here.
What is the quantum of budget savings now being held up in the Senate?
Well, there's about $40 billion worth of budget savings or thereabouts that are being blocked by the Labor Party. And you've got to remember that includes $5 billion in savings that Labor under Julia Gillard and Kevin Rudd themselves initiated and banked in their budget, but which Labor under Bill Shorten recklessly and irresponsibly and for pure political reasons is now opposing. So Bill Shorten, as Labor leader, is even more reckless than Julia Gillard and Kevin Rudd were, if that was possible.
So does that constitute a budget crisis?
Well, we inherited a budget in very bad shape from the Labor Party, $123 billion in projected deficits in their last budget, which came on top of $191 billion in deficits in their first 5 budgets, and a spending growth trajectory which was massively unsustainable, taking us to $667 billion in government gross debt within the decade and growing beyond that without corrective action. Our first budget in May is our plan to deal with the debt and deficit disaster that we inherited from the Labor Party, and we are progressing and implementing that budget in an orderly and methodical fashion. What was, of course, happening was that some journalists in particular didn't seem to quite appreciate that, as has always been the case with governments that don't have the numbers in the Senate, that we would have to negotiate some of those structural reforms through the Senate. But of course we do have time to do that because some of the more structural savings don't come into effect for some time.
But where has the urgency gone? Because for much of the last year, you and other members of the government have been talking budget crisis, budget emergency, and now a week before Parliament returns, the urgency of that seems to have gone.
Well, that is not quite right. I mean, you'd know. I mean, if you look at my interviews with you over the last year on a fortnightly basis, you'll see that I've said on many occasions that we will repair the budget mess that we've inherited from the Labor Party in an orderly and methodical fashion. Of course, we are continuing to progress that. I mean, we've only had 2 weeks of the new Senate sitting, and the first Senate fortnight was always going to be dominated with the carbon tax repeal, the mining tax repeal, and a series of related matters. I mean, you've got to remember, I mean, up until 30 June this year, Labor and the Greens controlled the Senate completely, and Labor and the Greens have been putting politics ahead of the national interest. I mean, look no further. I've already mentioned about the $5 billion in savings measures initiated and banked by Labor, which they're now opposing. But even the Greens. I mean, the Greens right now are opposing the indexation of the fuel excise. They're now the party which says that they believe in regular reductions in the real value of the excise on fuel. So that is what we were dealing with in the Senate until 30 June. Labor Party and the Greens putting politics ahead of the national interest. We now have got options in terms of talking to 8 crossbench senators who are all taking a very constructive and positive approach to their engagement with government. And we're very hopeful that over time we'll be able to get most of our budget measures through.
The government this week has been pointing to the almost 99% of budget measures that have passed through the Parliament in the form of appropriation bills. Now, if that didn't happen, it would be certainly a budget crisis, would be in a Whitlam-esque scenario. But aside from those crucial appropriation bills, what structural savings can you point to that the government has actually had success in passing through Parliament?
Well, our single biggest savings measure has already gone through the Parliament. It is a $7.6 billion reduction in funding for foreign aid over the forward estimates. And of course, structurally, we've reduced the funding growth trajectory from the one that Kevin Rudd had put Australia on, which was manifestly unsustainable. There are a range of other savings measures that have gone through, tools for our trade as a reform to the way we support our apprentices. That comes with a good structural saving. The budget repair levy has also gone through, and there are a range of other measures that have gone through. And I mean, the mining tax repeal obviously is the next cup of the rank, where we have to deal with Labor's failed tax to which they again recklessly and irresponsibly attached billions and billions of dollars in growing unfunded spending promises and related budget measures. We obviously got to deal with that now in a way that takes pressure off the budget and off the economy into the future.
And has there been any further consideration on the possibility of splitting those spending measures attached to the mining tax? Is the government still ruling that out?
Well, we will not be splitting the unfunded promises that Labor attached to the mining tax from the mining tax repeal legislation. We went to the last election very clearly indicating to the electorate that we would repeal the mining tax, which is a bad tax, and that we would repeal the unfunded promises that Labor recklessly and irresponsibly attached to that tax. Now, we are having very constructive conversations with crossbenchers, including and in particular the Palmer United Party, about how we can achieve our objective to scrap the mining tax without putting the budget under undue pressure into the future. You've got to remember, I mean, the $10 billion in unfunded promises that the Senate in the middle of July said to the government they wanted us to keep. That is a figure that continues to grow over time. So if we left those unfunded promises in place, it would put more and more pressure on the budget into the future. So we are talking to the Palmer United Party and to other crossbench senators represented in the Senate on how we can ensure that we get rid of this bad tax, but that we also make sure that we don't expose the budget to undue structural pressure into the future as a result.
One of the other key measures that the government has had trouble getting support for is the $7 co-payment. A lot of focus on that this week. Most of the revenue will go into this Medical Research Future Fund, not directly to the budget bottom line. Now, in an opinion piece for The Australian yesterday, I think it was, you spoke of how the Medical Research Future Fund would become an asset on the budget balance sheet eventually. Can you just explain that for us?
Well, not eventually. That is, I mean, immediately. I mean, if you take efficiencies on the expenditure side and you take revenue from a co-payment and you accumulate it into a capital fund, that capital fund becomes an asset on the government's balance sheet, reducing government net debt. And what needs to be clearly understood is that under our proposal, the only money that would be invested in additional medical research would be the net earnings generated by that capital fund. And of course, over time, as the capital accumulates to $20 billion, which we believe would happen within 6 years under our proposals, that those net earnings continue to increase, which means that over time we would be able to double the current investment in medical research on a fiscally sustainable basis.
I absolutely agree that setting up a fund like this is prudent policy when we have the money for it. But as you point out, or have pointed out many times, currently Australia is paying $1 billion a month in interest on our debt. Now, everyone watching this knows that when you have a credit card maxed out, the focus really should be on paying off the credit card rather than setting up a new savings account, if you will. Yeah. So what's the difference here?
Well, David, I totally understand the point you're making, but you've got to also remember the commitments that we made in the lead up to the last election. And in the lead up to the last election, we made a very clear promise that we would maintain the funding envelope for health at the same level as was in place over the forward estimates at the time of the last election. So what we are working hard to keep faith with the commitments that we made in the lead up to the last election, and that is why we have said to the Australian people, we do believe that we need to make efficiencies on the expenditure side in health. We do believe that we need to introduce a price signal in order to ensure that in the context of the growing demand for healthcare services as a result of the ageing of the population, that the limited resources from taxpayers are allocated to a growing demand for services in the most efficient way possible. But what we've also then said is in order to keep faith with our commitment that we would not be cutting the overall funding envelope for health in the forward estimates period, we are proposing to put all of this money into the Medical Research Future Fund, where it will accumulate over time, generate income, and that income itself would be invested in medical research, which will help us improve the quality of healthcare and the efficiency of healthcare into the future, which in itself will of course help us put downward pressure on the spending growth trajectory in health into the future. So from our point of view, this is really a win-win-win policy proposal which will help us ensure that all Australians can have timely and affordable access to quality healthcare into the future in a way that is also affordable for the taxpayer over the medium to long term.
Okay, well, just back to what really was my original question. Is there a budget emergency now? Is there a budget crisis?
Well, we inherited a budget in a mess from the Labor Party. And you've got to remember, between the budget in May last year and the pre-election economic and fiscal outlook just 11 weeks...
Is there a crisis? Because you were happy to use the language of emergency and crisis previously. Why not now?
Well, this is very important. So in the period from May last year, within 11 weeks to the election, the budget position deteriorated by $33 billion, or $3 billion a week. So we inherited not only a very bad debt position, not only did we inherit $123 billion in projected deficits, we also inherited a rapidly deteriorating position. And obviously we had to work very hard to turn that around. Now, our budget is our plan to deal with the debt and deficit disaster that we inherited from the Labor Party. But we are facing a budget emergency as a country. We are facing a very challenging fiscal situation, but the government is dealing with it in an orderly and methodical fashion. And of course, we're dealing with it through the usual and normal processes of the Parliament. And having to negotiate budget measures through the Senate is situation normal. There's actually nothing new, unusual or unexpected about it, except that perhaps some sections of the media seem to think that unless you had passed the whole budget within weeks of the budget being delivered, there was somehow a situation where we were no longer on top of the process. Well, we are on top of the process. We do know what we're doing. We're working through it very carefully, and we're very confident that with the goodwill from people on the crossbench, not on the Labor side or the Greens side of the Parliament, but certainly on the crossbench, that we will be able to repair the budget mess, the debt and deficit disaster that the Labor Party left behind.
Finance Minister Senator Mathias Cormann, thanks so much for your time today.
Always good to be here.
After the break, we'll get the response from Labor. Stay with us.